Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. With Liverpool winning the league as your first wish, I'm here to grant you your second wish for a webinar on the State of Ransomware 2020. We have some great material today, so let's get straight into it. As always, we make these webinars as interactive as possible. So if you have any questions or discussion points, please share in the chat function. If you don't mind, John, just swapping it over, there you'll see the chat function there. If you've got any questions, put them through on that side. The webinar will be recorded and it will be published to our webinar library on our website as well. So to kick things off, let me do introductions into a little bit more detail. So today you've got myself, a member of the business solutions team at Beckler, and I'm fortunate enough to be joined by John at Sophos, a leading engineer and renowned for his knowledge in security across the industry. I'm sure he'll talk all about that shortly. We've worked with Sophos for a number of years as a key strategic vendor and a platinum partner for the group. And our relationship stems from being a big believer in simple security is better security. So I think we personally believe that Sophos follow that to a T, and together we're fully confident in our solutions as well. So to set the scene, we're going to talk about ransomware in 3 stages. First one is going to be the past, so we're going to touch upon what got us here today. We're then going to take some time in the present to look at the facts and the drivers around what's shaping the world of security. And then finally, looking forward, we're going to explore how protection of ransomware is changing and the type of solutions that are enabling that as well. So I'm going to hand over to John to start with stage 1, the past. Over to you, John.
Brilliant. Thanks, AJ. And yeah, thank you everybody for joining in. So what we're going to do is talk a little bit, first of all, about the past and the state of play as it was and how ransomware really came to be such a significant and prevalent threat. And what we're going to do is we're going to start looking at the quantities of malware just in general that are out there. And given that you came to a webinar that's based on security, then I'm sure you probably already knew in advance that the world is a scary place and there's a lot of malware out there. But if you look at this graph, and if you could extrapolate this back into the past, you'll see that the sheer quantities of malware have dramatically increased. And the net result is that things like ransomware are really top of IT managers' agendas because of the sheer quantity of threats that exist out there. And of course, it's not just about the quantities of threats that are out there, but also it's about the evolution of malware and really more than anything else, the shift in motivation of malware. So, you know, if we could take that graph and look further into the past, when I started out in my IT career, then malware was really about geeks out geeking other geeks and showing off their technical prowess. So you might have had things like your screen being turned upside down or your cursor being changed, but malware has changed very significantly and the motivations are now very much financially orientated. So it's not just about having more malware, but it's actually about malware which is trying to extort out of unfortunate victims. And how this really started out was reasonably innocently. So we started out with fake applications and particularly fake antivirus. So these things would have existed primarily around the sort of early 2000s, maybe the late 90s, programs that claim to be security software because security was starting to become a mainstream topic, that would do lightning fast scans of your system and then claim that you got a bunch of malware issues. And then what it would do is suggest that if you buy the premium version of the product or you activated your product, then you would be protected and those issues would be removed. Of course, this is complete scamming. There's no malware on the machine apart from the one that you can see front and center on your screens. And it was just a way of trying to dupe people out of money. But people got wise to that very, very quickly. So the cyber criminals had to change tack because it was no longer successful. And really the sort of epiphany moment or the really significant change was in 2013, where we started to see not the first types of ransomware, that actually happened much earlier, but the first types of ransomware that were mainstream and hit a large number of victims. So this is Cryptolocker, which you might recognize from 2013. What would happen here is that our victim would be duped into opening a malicious attachment that would then launch and encrypt at a very strong level, 256-bit encryption, all of the files on that target device. And once those files were encrypted, the only way that you were going to get your data back would be to pay the cyber criminals and get a decryption key so that you could get your data back. Cryptolocker was really one of the first types of ransomware that every victim had their own unique key. And what it means is if you pay your fine, if you pay that ransom, then that key is only good for you as a victim, and it's no good for your friends, your neighbors, other businesses. Everybody has to pay separately. And this was one of the first types of ransomware which really spread very, very quickly. But of course, things changed, and much like that first iteration of ransomware actually borrowed a lot of coding from a very, very early version of encryption software. In 2017, we saw two types of ransomware which both borrowed technologies and coding from earlier types of malware. So what we see here, if you don't recognize these by sight, you will definitely recognize these by name. On the left-hand side, we've got WannaCry. On the right-hand side, we've got NotPetya. Both of these were blending things like network worms in order to make the ransomware much more virulent. So what happened is if one of your devices on your network were to become compromised with one of these two flavors of ransomware, then very, very quickly that ransomware would look across your network and try and find other host machines that it can infect and therefore spread around and maximize the impacts of that particular type of ransomware. And this is why in 2017, in the summertime, we saw so many headlines around WannaCry and NotPetya, both bringing a lot of large organizations to their knees, because, like I said, once you find one victim, then the malware is out there trying to find other victims so that it can spread that infection around and really cripple the organization so that they become so desperate they have to pay the fine. Now, if we move forward just a little bit more, then in 2019 we started to see the first iterations of ransomware, which we would term as being persistent. So Imitet, Ryuk, and many examples like this are persistent, so that what they will do is find the machine where they can actually hide out. Our victim goes through that cleaning process and gets rid of the ransomware, and all of a sudden it's sprung back up again and it's spreading around the network all over again. And this is one of the most significant threats out there at the moment, is this idea of persistent ransomware, which seems almost impossible to get rid of. But this is only really the tip of the iceberg, because at Sophos we've already observed in excess of 200 different crypto ransomware families, and it only takes an enterprising cyber criminal to take some kind of vulnerability or some method of spreading around like worms or something different and blending these things together, and we fully expect at some point to see another headline grabber like WannaCry, just by blending in established bits of tech.
And John, that list is growing rapidly, isn't it? Daily.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we still see huge ones, and we'll look at the quantities of individual malware types in a short while. But a question I often get asked is, what does it look like across the globe? What are my chances in various different countries? And you can see that on the screen here. So we carried out a survey talking to many different network admins across the globe, and one of the things that we found actually is that the UK is kind of just slightly below average when it comes to ransomware and its prevalence. So 48% of UK organizations that we surveyed had experienced some kind of ransomware attack in the previous year. Statistically speaking, the worst off place is India, and opposite end of the spectrum is South Africa, but the UK kind of sits somewhere in the middle, just maybe slightly below the global average. And it doesn't seem to matter what size organization you are. Sometimes ransomware is perceived to be a big business problem and a large corporate problem, and it absolutely isn't the case. So there's a fairly even split between ransomware victims of sub 1,000 and in excess of 1,000 seats. Again, this is looking at things globally and also looking at the UK. It doesn't necessarily seem to be targeted to one particular size of organization. The significant difference, however, is that if you're a bigger organization, then you're probably in a better place in terms of protection, because you've got a little bit more IT budget, you've got staff and people that can help you stay protected. But conversely, because you've got a bigger attack surface, then you are potentially more likely to get hit. And you've got more assets in play. And if you get that kind of ransomware that spreads around the network, then obviously the detriment could be greater if you've got a bigger network to be looking after. So it's a real case of swings and roundabouts, unfortunately. It also doesn't particularly matter which sector you're in. It doesn't matter whether you're in education, in healthcare, in any particular vertical. The stats look very, very similar. However, if you're looking for a slightly easier ride, then it would appear, looking at this graph, that you might be best off making a move into the public sector if you're not there already. But essentially, again, it doesn't really matter which type of organization you are equally likely to experience some kind of ransomware.
John, sorry to interrupt you. I think there's a little bit of lag. I think a couple of issues. So if you don't mind, do you mind turning your video off just to improve I'll turn mine off as well. There might be some lag there.
Yeah, there we go. That might just help a little. Let's try that. Okay. So in terms of remediation costs, then it's pretty much a bad state of play wherever you are. But as I already alluded to, if you are a larger organization with more employees, then it typically costs more to clean up ransomware, typically because it spreads around the network so much more quickly and has a greater impact from that point of view. Interestingly, you might think that paying the ransom is the easy way to deal with your problem, and actually, surprisingly, it tends to increase the cost quite dramatically if you do pay the ransom, because you're still paying for cleanup and you're paying the ransomware off as well. And just a little anecdote as well from inside the industry, and it's an unfortunate term, but people who pay the ransom, they end up on what's called a sucker list that cyber criminals will circulate between themselves. So in other words, if we know that you're vulnerable to ransomware and that you're inclined to pay the ransom off, then you actually become a much more appealing target for other cyber criminals. So you're almost inviting repeat attacks by paying the ransom off. So far better, obviously, if you are unfortunate enough not to be protected, that you don't pay the ransom and you resort to things like using backups if you've got them to restore the data, rather than actually paying the cyber criminals off. So in summary, from some of the statistics that you saw there, globally, 51% of organizations have been hit by ransomware within the last year. 48% is the number in the UK, typically more than once, incidentally. But one of the interesting things that I found from that report, if you go into more detail, is that actually 90% of the organizations had actually gone out and, in theory, done the right things. They got endpoint protection in play, it was up to date and it was properly configured, and yet 73% of the attacks still managed to encrypt data. And what that tells us is that maybe the current state of play with endpoint technology maybe isn't as great as it could be, and there are better ways to protect yourself. And I'm going to come on to some of those points in just a short while. Also, interestingly as well, 20% of organizations couldn't determine the source of the attack. So why do these statistics look so bad? Well, we talked a little bit about the quantities of malware out there, and AJ mentioned the fact that this is increasing on a daily basis. In our labs at Sophos, we see 450,000 new variants of malware every single day, a percentage of which will be ransomware. And this is the biggest problem, because that quantity of malware is so difficult to keep up with. And this is why we have had to alter our approach when it comes to security. So we absolutely advocate the layered defense approach. So this idea of having multiple different layers of protection is really, really important, but also changing the way that we deal with protection, because if you look at the way an attack takes place, and it always follows this kind of process to one degree or another, there's always stages of an attack, and if we can actually break one of those chains in the cycle, then often we can actually fend off the attack. So this is why it's really, really important to have this idea of layered defense, and in particular looking at how you defend on the endpoint level. So traditional antivirus works essentially by carrying out file scans, and organizations like Sophos, we maintain a labs infrastructure so that we can basically collate as much malware as we possibly can, create a signature for each one of those, and then distribute that around as part of the updates. But the problem is that doesn't work in an environment where we see so much new malware every day, because there's a very real chance that your security vendor will not necessarily be the first person to see that malware. It could be that you find the malware beforehand. And because computers are fundamentally dumb by nature, and what they're doing here is with traditional AV is effectively playing a game of match, you may not be protected. You know, this isn't a Sophos problem. This is just a problem with the way that traditional antivirus works. And that's why we see such a drive towards next generation technology. So, you know, if you're trying to justify the expense of going to next generation technology, either to yourself or to your board or to your managers or whomever, then there are 450,000 reasons every single day why you need next gen, because what next gen will give us is the ability for the endpoint to recognize for itself what is likely to be malware, and not necessarily rely on the data that's coming from your security vendor of choice. Now, a lot of the things that I'm going to say here are fairly generic across the industry, but obviously I work for Sophos, so I'm going to be talking a little bit about how we productize next generation technology at Sophos, but a lot of these things ring true for any next generation vendor. So what we market our next generation technology as is Intercept X, and what that gives us is the enhanced ability to recognize malware either on its way in through exploits and delivery, and also when it executes, but importantly, not necessarily relying on external data and using what's in the product itself. So it does all sorts of clever things. One of those is machine learning capabilities. So inbuilt with Intercept X is an artificial intelligence engine, and it's been trained on a subset of the 750,000 malware examples that we've got on record. It's learned attributes and key characteristics such that it can perform an educated guess when it sees something new, so it doesn't rely on having an absolute signature for it, but can recognize on things like behaviors. One of the other important bits of tech that's in here as well is the anti-ransomware capability. So if you remember, ransomware is all about encrypting data, and Intercept X will block any attempt to encrypt data from an illegitimate process. It doesn't matter how that malware got in, it doesn't matter how it's encrypting the data. The only thing that Intercept X cares about is the fact that it is ransomware, because it is encrypting data. Okay, so that's very important, because it means that even if you get hit by a new variant of ransomware, that Intercept X is there to protect from the get-go, purely and simply on the behaviors that it sees in front of it and it's exhibiting. So that's a little bit about next generation technology and why it's so important. But then on top of that, you might be hearing in the industry talk about products that have EDR capabilities, or endpoint detection and response. So let's take a look at what EDR is and why it's better than straightforward next gen technology, and why it might be important to you as an organization. So if we go back to the attack chain, if you've got Intercept X with EDR, which is our version of this technology, then it allows you to look further across the attack chain, because we're looking at the delivery from a reputation point of view. Is this file something that we've seen before? Do we know that it's good? Do we consider it to be bad? Then we've got behavior checks and anomaly detections that are happening after the malware has started to take root on the organization. And I can show you some of those things in that graph. If I just roll back very briefly, you can see what we've got here. EDR is giving us the ability to see, well, what is the type of malware that's out there? What is it reaching out to? What is it communicating with? And it helps to illuminate the attack chain overall. Okay, so it gives you extra insights into what potential malware might have touched, what might be on your network that's not been detonated yet, and just gives you a much better visibility into the whole process, so that you can help to clean up your network and actually go and look for threats across the network for yourself. So essentially, when it comes to protecting your endpoint, again, these are all Sophos products, but whichever vendor you look at will have similar sort of tiers to their products. You can start out with signature-based antivirus on the very far left-hand side, which will only protect you against malware that security vendor has previously seen. Or you can start looking at next-generation technologies that will help to protect you against new and unknown types of malware that have not previously been seen before. Or you can move the slider a little bit further, and you can look at EDR technologies that will help you to start threat hunting and recognize undetonated malware. And at Sophos, we also offer a service as well. So the sort of top tier offering is a managed threat response service where Sophos will actually use our security operations center and scan your networks and help you to detect stuff on your network. And if you want us to not only detect those things proactively, but also respond. And that service is particularly good for organizations that really take their security seriously, but maybe don't feel that they've got the time or the expertise to plow into an EDR product to actually maintain that dashboard, and would prefer that somebody who's a security expert actually does that for them. So those are the sort of suites of offerings that you should find from most vendors. However, there's another big thing ahead that I want to show you before we wrap up, and that is the idea of cybersecurity as a system. So this is a big change which is happening in the industry, really starting to look at products working together as a system. And at Sophos, we call this synchronized security. And it's this concept of what traditionally would have been independent security products, instead of just working in isolation, actually sharing meaningful data and coordinating their defenses together. So one example of that might be if we detect that one of your endpoints has got some kind of compromise, that what happens is it will tell the firewall, and the firewall can isolate that device and prevent it from talking to the internet until it's cleaned up. Is just one example. And we believe absolutely passionately in this approach at Sophos for two key reasons. One is we believe that we can give you an unparalleled level of protection by coordinating defenses together. You know, we can do things that you could never do by having individual products all doing their own things. And we believe as well that by coordinating our defenses together, we can significantly reduce the impact of an incident and the time it takes to respond. So in that illustration that I gave you there, you know, for example, if the endpoint gets compromised in some way, that the system can isolate that from the internet using the firewall, and can also prevent that endpoint talking to other devices in the network. So that concept of ransomware that finds a bridgehead and then immediately spreads across the rest of the network, it just wouldn't happen in this vision of synchronized security, because the moment we detect that endpoint is compromised, we isolate it and prevent it from spreading that infection anywhere else in the organization. So that gives you an idea about the power that you can unleash by having cybersecurity working as a system. But of course, you know, technology is only ever a part of the story. So it's really important to consider things like security training internally to get your staff doing the right things and maybe not clicking on those spam links, and doing that training and education. And of course, the other thing as well is to make sure you align yourself with an IT specialist partner that can help you go through the process of picking the right products and getting the right things sorted out. So I guess, AJ, that's probably where you may want to talk a little bit about this slide.
Yeah, thank you, John. I think as I mentioned in the beginning, you know, we're big believers in simple security is better security, and to have a synchronized approach, we put a very clear process in the background when it comes to engagement. So in terms of reading this slide, as it's an infinity sign, you can really start anywhere, but where we usually see discussions begin is at the product requirements, so the left-hand side. And that's usually based out of a problem which has occurred, an issue, a threat has happened, or some form of phishing attack, and we need to find a solution. What we aim to do is relate that back, so relate the requirement back to the wider security strategy piece, which is in the middle. And it's vital that we do this, because if we don't do that, we start to talk about security in individual silos. And if we start to do that, we increase the risk, and it's important we integrate the solutions back together where possible. So we have to always think about the bigger picture. We have to think about the wider strategy. And that kind of goes what John was saying in regards to security as a system going forward. So once that requirement is in line with the strategy, we can then follow into understanding the requirements, assessing the landscape, and then through into that demo and technical evaluation. But as it's an infinity sign, we are continuously repeating this process against the different requirements that are coming in to constantly evolve your security posture with the new incoming threats as well. So I would say the next action, please have a think about your requirements and the potential gaps that you see, so we can start that journey if you're not already on it anyway. And then to finally wrap up as well, so if we just do a bit of a recap, we can kind of sum up some of our findings here, and then what you should be doing about them. So if we start with the first one, Start with the assumption that you will be hit. Ransomware does not discriminate. Every organization is a target, regardless of size, sector, geography. Plan cybersecurity based on the assumption that you will get hit. The second point is invest in anti-ransomware technology to stop unauthorized encryption. So, as Don mentioned, 24% of survey respondents said that they were hit by ransomware, were able to stop the attack before the data could be encrypted. It's a very important and powerful message there. And that kind of couples nicely onto the next one. In terms of Nextgen is a must-have. When it comes to security, legacy runs risk. So continuously ask yourself, if the bad guys are improving, then how is my security improving? One should naturally correlate to the other, and if you can get ahead of the game, even better as well. The next point, don't assume that because you put up a nice big fence that the burglars won't come into your house. Think about if they do get past, then what? Deploy a layered defense. They'll try and they'll try again. Ransomware actors use a wide range of techniques to get around your defenses. So when one is blocked, they'll move on to the next one until they find some way in. So you need to defend against all vectors of attack there. And then finally, as I mentioned before, don't talk about security in silos. Integrate it in and continuously look at the bigger picture so we can build that and build upon that security strategy going forward. So I'm just going to pause there and wrap up. John, if you don't mind swapping to the next slide for me.
Of course.
Just going to have a look and see what questions have come through. Just give me 2 secs. Right, okay, thank you. So the first one actually is a good one, John. How do I get off the sucker list?
How do I get off the sucker list?
Yeah,
that is a great question. I honestly don't know. Is the honest answer? The best strategy really is to not get on it in the first place. There are ways and means. There are various different tools out there that you can use to. I wouldn't advocate trawling the dark web yourself, but there are organisations that will trawl the dark web on your behalf, and you can spot things like compromised passwords and that kind of thing. But how you get off that is, I guess, probably just by age, and eventually, obviously, like any other type of data, eventually it becomes meaningless. But just as best as you can, don't get on the list in the first place.
Thanks, John. The next question is around vendors. So, we spoke here about having one vendor for your security strategy, but having multiple vendors, where does that put you? Is that a risk, or is that seen as an advocate for that?
Okay, that's an interesting question, actually. It's one that comes up a lot when I talk to customers. So traditionally, a lot of organizations went down the route of having different security vendors in different places across their network, and the main driver for that actually stems back to the way that antivirus works. So remember, we talked about signatures, we talked about different vendors creating those signatures and then offering the protection up. Well, the logic went that if you had, let's say, one AV vendor that was running at your gateway and a different one running on your endpoint, that maybe one of those vendors might come up with the signatures a bit quicker, and that you were somehow better protected by sort of splitting your loyalties and having protection in different places. And it candidly is a slightly older way of thinking now, because the speed it takes for security vendors to create a signature is pretty much the same across the whole setup. And as you've already seen, signatures are fairly meaningless in the grand scheme of protection. It's far better to have technology that kind of doesn't rely on that and works out for itself. What I would say is that if you have multiple different vendors, then you are never going to benefit from this idea of coordinated defenses. And the advantages of having endpoints that will automatically isolate themselves if they get compromised probably outweighs any benefit of having multiple different vendors running on your network. The other thing you've got to bear in mind as well is it's pretty difficult to become an expert in all this stuff. And if you've got a dashboard from vendor A and a dashboard from vendor B, C, and D, then how are you supposed to keep all those things up to date and set them up properly and really understand those products? Whereas if you've got everything in a single dashboard, it's just easier to coordinate those defenses together. So my personal opinion is that, whichever vendor you select, having one vendor that you can manage from one place and coordinate your defenses together and have it automatically respond is greater than the benefit of having different vendors in different places.
And do you find, John, then, on that side, then, do you find the vendors behind the scenes that are talking to one another to find ways to integrate the technologies together to better serve customers there, or?
Well, that's an
What's your
interesting
view on
one,
that?
and it is something that often gets communicated between vendors, and I think we all kind of like the idea of that now. But the problem is that there isn't really at the moment a security framework that allows vendors to really communicate with each other. Sophos we're quite a big believer in this, actually. So if you look at most Sophos products, they either have API capabilities or we're building API capabilities into products, so that in theory other vendors could hook into those APIs. But at the moment, nobody's really taking us up on that. And you know, it's a nice idea, but at the moment, as it stands, you know, we're building those bridgeheads in terms of being able to have APIs, but it's not really being used in anger. At the moment, the only real integrations that we see are inside a vendor's ecosphere. So obviously we've built out at Sophos quite a big ecosphere of products like endpoint, like wireless, like mobile, like encryption and firewall, and all of our product, well, most of our products have that capability of using synchronized security to communicate together, because you know we really believe in that. But it's very much a proprietary system right now. But you know, who knows what the future will hold.
Okay. And I think this is relating a question back to the slide that you put up around the different variations of attack levels across the globe.
Yeah.
Someone's asked, what are South Africa doing so well?
I don't know if it's necessarily doing so well as maybe just slightly less appealing as a target. I can't really rationalize that, to be honest with you, but I think that's a case that probably not so much that they are better defended, but they're probably just not getting attacked that much in relative terms. Probably because of a combination of not that many juicy targets versus those targets are quite juicy, are quite well funded. It's probably that sort of perfect combination, really. Whereas if you looked at the opposite side of the spectrum and you looked at India, then there's a large number of targets that probably have not necessarily invested that much in infrastructure. So I'm not sure is the honest answer to that one, but I think they're probably just not getting attacked as much.
Okay, fair enough. Seems like that's all the questions. So whilst we just wait for any more to come through, John, if you don't mind switching to the next slide, I can just explain what's coming up. So upcoming webinars in July. The next one, we are fortunate enough to be joined by Nutanix to talk about simplify the path to public cloud. So we've got a great whiteboarding session where we're going to sort of show from start to finish how you move the cloud in the most simplistic model possible. And then on the 30th of July, we're going to try and demystify SD-WAN and get some understanding about, one, the types of SD-WAN, and two, you know, is it fit for your organization, and how do you justify it being a fit for your organization? There doesn't seem to be any more questions coming through, so we will stay on the line till 22 if any questions do come through. If not, thank you for joining. Have a great rest of the day, and hopefully we'll speak to you soon. And thank you, John, for your time as well.
Oh, you're very welcome, and thanks for the questions.
No problem. As I mentioned, we're on here for the next 5 minutes anyway, if you have any questions. Quite like that South Africa question, John. That's a good point.
Yeah, it's a good one.
What are they doing so well?
So wow, yeah. The other question that often comes actually is, where are the attacks coming from? And that's a really interesting story, because there's no easy way to tell. You know, in the advent, so talking about cloud computing actually, and as much as we all, as you know, as the good guys embrace cloud technologies, then actually cyber criminals do that as well. So it's quite often that a lot of the servers that actually launch these attacks typically reside in I'm not going to name any names, but public cloud vendors. And what actually we've started to see is a real shift to the attack sources, or at least the apparent attack sources, actually mirror very closely the distribution of public cloud servers. So the cyber criminals are actually kind of hiding where they really are, because they're using the public cloud against us.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, they really have embraced cloud technology. And the other thing as well, so obviously one of the other big industry changes has been over the years has been, product X as a service. So, like mobile as a service, that sort of thing. Well, the cyber criminals actually kind of a long way ahead of us on this one. So one of the reasons we see so much malware out there is that you can actually basically have ransomware as a service. So if you wanted to become a cyber criminal and go down the route of ransomware, and I would never advocate that as a lifestyle choice, incidentally, but you don't even have to be you'd have to be a nerd to do this stuff anymore. There are actually dashboards on the dark web, and you can say, I wanna launch a ransomware campaign, and you've got to come up with the ideas about how to promote it. So come up with an idea around phishing, for example, but then the cyber criminals will actually kind of join the dots and make the ransomware for you. And basically they cream a percentage off, so you'll get some of the benefits of your attack, but the cyber criminals, you're also kind of paying for their time and paying for their service. Some of them, even, believe it or not, they actually offer sort of guarantees, and what they will do is they will constantly test their ransomware against a selection of the security vendors out there, and they will subtly change their code when they start getting detected. So remember, we talked again about signatures and about the way that signatures work. Well, because computers are fundamentally dumb, then if you change like a tiny bit of meaningless data inside your file, that technically becomes a new file. So the cyber criminals will alternate the way that their files is structured so that it evades capture in traditional sense. And like I said, you can pay the cyber criminals a premium so that your ransomware mutates every time it gets caught. Sometimes called server-side polymorphism, which is a fancy term, basically means that every victim gets a slightly different iteration of the ransomware.
It's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah, so these
Industry
guys,
built.
very much so. Interestingly enough as well, so a little take home for you all is that cybercrime is now bigger than sort of regular physical crime in terms of value. You're more likely to be hit by cybercrime than being mugged in the street, effectively.
And I know, John, I mentioned earlier about, if the bad guys are improving, we need to improve our security. Where do you see that line in terms of, do you feel they are far in advance in terms of what we're doing at an industry level, or do you think there's quite a healthy balance there?
If you'd asked me that question a couple of years ago, then, and I took my corporate hat off for a second, I probably would have said that it's a game of catch up, because at the time we were using signatures, and you always have to, in a signature based world, you always have to react. So you see the malware, you create the signature, you defend it. You see the next bit of malware, you create the signature, you defend it. But now we've moved into this idea of next generation technology, that then really the balance has been quite heavily redressed. We have now got software that can work out for itself what is likely to be malware. The other thing, which I kind of glossed over as well, actually, one of the benefits that Intercept X has got is something called exploit prevention. So I assume the audience is fairly familiar with the idea of patching software and keeping those bits of software up to date. The reason you do that is because the malware often needs some kind of hook, some kind of exploit in a weak piece of software in order to do its damage and run. And Intercept X has what's called exploit prevention technology inbuilt with it. So what we found when we started to do research is that even though there's so much malware out there, actually underlying all of that, there's only 28 different attack methods that you can effectively use to what's called execute arbitrary code on a target device. In other words, if I want to own a laptop out in the world, there are actually 28 underlying methods, and only 28 underlying methods right now that I can use. And exploit prevention actually kind of sits across all those different methodologies, so that if a new bit of ransomware gets packaged up, a new bit of malware gets packaged up, and it's new, on the assumption that it's using one of those 28 underlying methods, then Intercept X is already protecting those devices because it understands what those hooks look like. It's a bit like if you imagine for a second that you were responsible for the physical security of someone like a high street bank, for example. If your security system relies on signatures, you'd have to create a signature for every type of vehicle that might try and do a ram raid. So like, a red car, a blue truck, a yellow JCB, which did actually happen on my high street, but that's probably another story for another time. The idea of exploit prevention is a bit like putting bollards up around the building. It doesn't matter then what type of vehicle you rock up in. The underlying technique of ram raiding is now no longer possible. it's kind of the closest physical real world analogy I can come up with.
Mm.
So to answer the original question, you know, when you've got these kind of security technologies that don't rely on having seen something before, then it does kind of address the balance a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely.
And certainly the power of machine learning is, I mean, some vendors tout machine learning as the silver bullet that solves all problems, and I'm not quite sure that we're there yet, but obviously the power of computing is such that you can now
it's certainly speeding up the response, right?
Exactly, yeah, and it's using that knowledge that we've seen of stuff before to be able to crunch the numbers and look at the behaviors, and then it is still effectively educated guess, but a pretty reliable educated guess that what we've got in front of us is actually a piece of malware. You know, and a human analyst could absolutely do that better, but could they do that at scale and quicker? Absolutely not.
Mm.
You know, that machine capability really, yeah, it does. It just empowers the device to weed through this sort of minefield of mass numbers of files at great speed and accurately perform results. I mean, not all machine learning products are equal. You know, there's different ways of doing machine learning. We use something called use a deep learning model, which is as close as it gets to the human brain in the way that it works. So it kind of follows all the potential outcomes to come to a conclusion, whereas some other machine learning technologies kind of a bit more fixed in their I want to say thought process, but you take my meaning. So yeah, it isn't always necessarily a silver bullet that solves all problem, but it certainly helps with the volumes of data and threats that we see.
Okay. On that note, John, I think that I can't see any further questions coming through, so we will wrap up. Thanks everyone who's still on the call. If there is any other questions, feel free to drop them through, email them to myself or to your account manager, and we can get those answered. And again, thanks John for your time. I appreciate it.
No, you're very welcome. No problem at all.
All right. Cheers everyone. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye now.